Imagine waking up one day and realizing that hardly anyone around you questions anything anymore. The world has grown so loud, so fast, and so saturated with endless streams of information that the human mind, once a tool for discovery, for reasoning, for genuine growth, has dulled into something far more passive. Instead of curiosity and inquiry, we see automatic reactions, surface-level opinions, and echo chambers where everyone repeats what feels comfortable. Think about what happens to a society when critical thinking fades away, when the ability to pause, reflect, and ask, "Is this really true?" is replaced by scrolling, clicking, and reacting. This is more than just a cultural inconvenience. It's what some modern philosophers describe as collective stupidity, a state where masses of people surrender their intellectual independence without even realizing it. That's what this discussion is about. We're going to unpack the unsettling reality behind the disappearance of critical thinking, why it matters more now than ever, and how thinkers like Carl Jung warned us about the psychological traps that keep us blind. Because at the heart of this issue lies a truth that might determine whether we reclaim our minds or lose them completely. Before we dive in, take a moment to subscribe, like, and share your reflections in the comments. This isn't the kind of content you simply consume. It's an invitation to reflect. And if you know someone who still values truth, share this with them. Thought only grows when it is challenged, questioned, and discussed. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Thinking is hard. And in today's world, it's not only difficult, it's actively discouraged. The modern environment doesn't reward deep thought. It rewards speed, certainty, and conformity. Algorithms feed us what we already believe. Schools test memorization, not exploration. Workplaces value efficiency over originality. Bit by bit, society trains us to stop questioning. The linguist and philosopher Noam Chomsky saw this coming decades ago. He called it the manufacturing of consent. In other words, when people are conditioned to agree without truly understanding, they become easy to manage and even easier to deceive. Critical thinking, once respected as a core human skill, is now treated as a nuisance. It disrupts online debates, slows down outrage culture, and threatens ideological bubbles. Simply asking, "But is this true?" can get you labeled as dangerous, naive, or out of touch. So, how did we arrive here? One of the most obvious drivers is information overload. Neuroscientist Daniel Levitin found that the average person today processes nearly 5 times more information in a single day than someone did just a few decades ago. Notifications, headlines, breaking news, ads, and endless updates bombard us constantly. The human brain wasn't designed for this. When overwhelmed, it starts looking for shortcuts. Group consensus, authority figures, peer signals. This is where social proof comes in. We assume that if something has 1 million likes or retweets, it must be true or important. That's not reason. That's a psychological shortcut. And it's one of the key reasons collective stupidity spreads so fast. But there's another factor at play, and it's even more dangerous: the collapse of sustained attention. Neuroscientist Marianne Wolf has shown that our brains are being rewired by digital habits. We skim, we multitask, we jump between tabs. We no longer sit with a book or a long argument. And here's the catch. Critical thinking requires sustained attention. You can't analyze, evaluate, or deeply reflect when your focus is fractured every 30 seconds by a new ping. Carl Sagan warned us about this in the 1990s. He said, "We live in a society exquisitely dependent on science and technology, in which hardly anyone knows anything about science and technology." His worry wasn't just ignorance. but the erosion of the capacity to think critically about the systems we rely on. Carl Jung would have taken this even further. He believed that when people avoid the effort of thinking deeply, they fall prey to what he called mass-mindedness. In his view, individuals who fail to question the world end up merging into the collective unconscious in its most primitive form, following trends, ideologies, or leaders without realizing that they've surrendered their individuality. For Jung, this wasn't just intellectual laziness. It was a profound psychological danger, a regression into herd mentality. And that's exactly what we're seeing today. Instead of genuine dialogue, people retreat into tribes. Instead of honest reflection, they repeat slogans. In place of Socratic questioning, we get emotional reactions. And the cost of this is enormous, because when people stop thinking, they stop questioning. And when they stop questioning, they become easy prey for manipulation, propaganda, and fear. So the challenge is clear. If we don't protect and practice critical thinking, we risk becoming passengers in our own lives, shaped not by reason, but by the loudest voices around us. If critical thinking is fading, it isn't just by accident. It's the result of systems, educational, cultural, technological, that quietly steer us away from reflection and into compliance. And perhaps the most powerful of these systems is the one we encounter earliest in life: school. John Taylor Gatto, an award-winning teacher and outspoken critic of traditional education, once argued that schools were never truly designed to create independent thinkers. Instead, they were structured during the industrial age to produce predictable, obedient workers. Students were trained to follow schedules, memorize facts, and obey authority. Skills useful for factories, but disastrous for cultivating free minds. Think back to your own schooling. How often were you rewarded for original thought? How often did curiosity slow you down, only for a teacher to say, "That's not on the test"? Over time, the message becomes clear. Don't question too much, don't wander outside the lines, and don't challenge the consensus. Conformity gets rewarded. Creativity is treated as distraction. This conditioning doesn't end at graduation. It follows us into adulthood, in the workplace, in media, even in friendships. Speaking out, questioning group consensus, or voicing an unpopular perspective can quickly lead to criticism or exclusion. And because humans are social creatures, the fear of being labeled difficult or controversial is often enough to silence even our most urgent doubts. Psychologist Erich Fromm captured this dynamic in his book, Escape from Freedom. He argued that many people secretly want to surrender their freedom of thought, because true freedom comes with responsibility. To think for yourself means you can no longer hide behind the crowd. You must accept uncertainty, complexity, and the uncomfortable reality that you may be wrong. For many, that burden is too heavy. So instead, they trade independence for comfort, reflection for distraction, and truth for security. Carl Jung saw a similar phenomenon at the level of the psyche. He observed that when people give up individuality, they slip into what he called the collective shadow. In Jung's framework, the shadow is the part of ourselves we refuse to see. On a collective scale, it becomes the dark side of society: blind conformity, prejudice, scapegoating, and fear-driven obedience. When individuals merge into the crowd, their personal responsibility dissolves. They act as though possessed, not by their own reason, but by the will of the group. And nowhere is this more visible today than on social media. What began as a tool for connection has mutated into a machine of manipulation. These platforms thrive not on truth, but on engagement. They are designed to keep you scrolling, clicking, and reacting, not thinking. Outrage, sensational headlines, and tribal conflicts are rewarded because they generate more attention than nuance or reflection. Think about how the algorithms work. They push you toward content that reinforces your beliefs because comfort keeps you hooked. They nudge you to respond instantly, emotionally, and often angrily because strong emotions fuel more clicks and more revenue. The result? Thoughtfulness becomes rare, reflection feels outdated, and reasoned debate drowns in a sea of noise. Marshall McLuhan, the philosopher of media, foresaw this shift in the 1960s. He famously wrote, "The medium is the message." His point was that the way information is delivered shapes how we think. Television, he argued, encouraged passivity. The internet, as we now see, encourages speed, certainty, and superficiality. Our tools are not neutral. They rewire our habits of thought. And what happens when truth itself becomes secondary to virality? When ideas are judged not by logic or evidence, but by how many people agree? That's when democracy turns into what Alexis de Tocqueville once feared: the tyranny of the majority. Not political, but cognitive. Ideas rise and fall, not based on merit, but on popularity. Carl Jung warned that when people fall under the spell of the collective, they stop recognizing their own individuality. They adopt opinions not because they've thought them through, but because those opinions provide belonging. And once belonging is at stake, truth becomes irrelevant. To Jung, this was a form of psychological possession, the ego surrendering to the herd. The tragedy is that in this state, society doesn't just lose thinkers, it loses depth, creativity, and the capacity to evolve. Because real progress doesn't come from repeating what everyone else believes. It comes from those rare individuals willing to step outside the collective and ask the uncomfortable questions. So when we see a culture obsessed with speed, certainty, and conformity, we're not just watching the decline of critical thinking. We're witnessing the rise of a deeper problem, a society that fears the individual mind and rewards the collective shadow. To understand why even intelligent people fall into collective stupidity, we need to look inward, into the very mechanics of the human mind. Because despite our faith in logic, the truth is that the brain is far more emotional than rational. Nobel Prize-winning psychologist Daniel Kahneman explained this in his groundbreaking work, Thinking, Fast and Slow. He described two systems of thought. System 1 is fast, instinctive, and emotional. It makes snap judgments, leaps to conclusions, and conserves energy. System 2 is slower, more deliberate, and more analytical. It requires focus and effort. Here's the catch. In today's high-speed, always-on world, most of us are stuck in fast mode. We don't have the time or the patience to engage System 2. So instead, we rely on shortcuts, stereotypes, gut feelings, or cues from others. These shortcuts feel efficient, but they make us vulnerable to manipulation. Politicians, marketers, and media outlets know this. They deliberately frame complex issues into simple binaries: good versus evil, us versus them, right versus wrong. They use emotionally charged language to bypass reason. They repeat the same narratives until familiarity itself convinces us they must be true. Not because we verified them, but because they feel familiar. And once something feels true, our brains begin defending it, often against all evidence. This is called confirmation bias, and it's one of the most powerful cognitive traps we face. We seek out evidence that supports our existing beliefs and ignore or dismiss what contradicts them. Even when confronted with strong counterarguments, we double down. It's not stupidity, it's human nature. Ask yourself honestly, how often do you search for perspectives that challenge your beliefs? How often do you listen to someone you disagree with, not to argue back, but to understand? If you're like most people, probably not as often as you'd like to believe. Another dangerous psychological pattern is groupthink, a phenomenon where the desire for harmony in a group overrides critical evaluation. It happens in corporations, governments, even families. People silence their doubts to avoid conflict. They go along with the majority, even when they sense something is wrong. The social cost of dissent feels greater than the risk of error. Irving Janis, the psychologist who coined the term, showed that even intelligent, well-intentioned groups can make disastrous decisions when groupthink takes over. History is filled with examples, from political blunders to corporate collapses, where no one spoke up because it felt safer to conform. Carl Jung would argue that this isn't just a social problem, it's a psychological one. In his view, when people merge into collective thinking, they allow the unconscious drives of the group to override their own individuality. The mass psyche, as Jung described it, is primitive and dangerous. It pulls people downward into conformity, where responsibility is dissolved, and the shadow, the darkest impulses of human nature, takes control. History shows us that progress has always come from those willing to resist this pull. Galileo challenged the church. Darwin challenged the scientific establishment. Nietzsche challenged morality. Martin Luther King Jr. challenged an entire social order. Each of them faced ridicule, rejection, or worse. But they thought anyway. They questioned anyway. And in doing so, they changed the trajectory of human history. But let's not romanticize it. Thinking critically in a society that punishes doubt is not easy. It's an act of rebellion. To pause and reflect while the crowd reacts requires courage. To say, "I don't know," when everyone else shouts certainty requires humility. And to hold your ground against the tide requires integrity. The reward, however, is invaluable. When you think critically, you gain clarity. You gain the quiet confidence that your beliefs are yours, not borrowed, not imposed, not dictated by the crowd. You begin to see through the manipulation, the propaganda, and the fear. Jung believed that this kind of individual awakening was not just intellectual, it was spiritual. Because to reclaim your mind is to reclaim your soul. And when you do that, you are no longer just another echo in the chamber. You become a voice of reason, a light in the shadow of the collective. For all the talk about information, education, and technology, there's another layer to the disappearance of critical thinking that cuts even deeper. We've lost the habit of conversing with ourselves. The inner dialogue, the quiet questioning of our own beliefs, has been drowned out by constant noise. We live in a time where people know more facts than ever, yet often feel more lost and unfulfilled. The reason is not a lack of data. It's the absence of reflection. We outsource our thinking to trending headlines, to influencers, to algorithms that curate our opinions for us. But no machine can replace the subtle personal act of asking, "Why do I believe what I believe?" Carl Jung warned that without self-examination, the psyche slips into unconscious patterns. He observed that individuals who fail to confront their inner world become dominated by collective illusions. Instead of living from their authentic selves, they play out roles imposed by culture, family, or ideology. Jung put it starkly. People would rather do anything, no matter how absurd, than face their own souls. This is why distractions feel so comforting. It's easier to binge content, repeat familiar slogans, or join the chorus of outrage than to sit alone with a troubling question. True reflection can be unsettling. It exposes contradictions, doubts, and blind spots. But avoiding it doesn't erase those tensions. It simply leaves us more vulnerable to manipulation. Philosophers have long understood this. Socrates described wisdom as recognizing one's own ignorance. Jiddu Krishnamurti said that to understand the immeasurable, the mind must become quiet and still. These insights point to a simple but radical truth. Thinking critically is not about accumulating more information, but about cultivating the patience to explore complexity. This patience is almost extinct. Our culture values speed over depth, certainty over humility, performance over substance. People rush to have opinions before they've even understood the problem. They defend positions not because they've examined them, but because their identity depends on it. In such an environment, silence and reflection are almost revolutionary. And yet, it is precisely in silence that wisdom begins. Reading deeply instead of skimming, listening attentively instead of reacting, sitting with a question instead of rushing to an answer. These practices rebuild the very muscles that critical thinking depends on. They allow us to distinguish between noise and signal, between manipulation and meaning. Another powerful tool is metacognition, simply paying attention to the way we think. When you notice yourself reacting emotionally to a headline, ask, what's driving this response? When you agree with something instantly, ask, do I believe this because it's true or because it's familiar? These small acts of awareness create distance between you and the collective current. Dialectical thinking takes this even further. It's the discipline of holding opposing ideas in tension without rushing to resolve them. This is not weakness, it's strength. It teaches flexibility, nuance, and humility. Real understanding often lies not in choosing one side or the other, but in exploring the space in between. Carl Jung called this process individuation, the journey of becoming a whole, integrated self. To individuate is to separate from the collective current, to claim responsibility for one's thoughts, and to confront the unconscious forces shaping them. For Jung, this was not optional. Without individuation, the individual remains captive to the herd, vulnerable to possession by ideologies, fads, or fear. The disappearance of critical thinking, then, is not just a social or technological issue. It is a psychological and spiritual one. To think clearly is to confront yourself, and many would rather avoid that confrontation. But the cost of avoidance is high. A society where individuality fades, where dialogue collapses, and where collective stupidity thrives unchecked. Beneath all the noise, algorithms, media, failing schools, polarized culture, lies a deeper cause of why critical thinking is vanishing. The real issue is not that people cannot think, but that they are afraid of what thinking might reveal. To examine the world honestly is also to examine ourselves, and that process can be profoundly unsettling. We live in an age where identity is treated as sacred. People define themselves by political parties, by beliefs, by tribes. To question an idea feels to many like a personal attack. But this is the illusion that silences thought. We begin to confuse who we are with what we believe. Jung warned about this trap. He insisted that true individuality emerges only when we detach from collective roles and dare to see our beliefs as temporary, not as our essence. Critical thinking, then, is not just an intellectual skill. It is a moral and even spiritual act. It is the willingness to put truth before comfort, growth before certainty, and freedom before approval. It is the decision to live with eyes open, even when the light stings. Once you begin to question honestly, You start noticing the patterns of manipulation around you, the media frames, the political tactics, the subtle nudges of culture. At first, this awareness can be overwhelming, but it is also liberating. Jung observed that people will do almost anything to avoid facing their own inner world. Yet the courage to confront unconscious fears, inherited assumptions, and hidden motivations is what separates true thinkers from passive followers. To ask yourself, why do I believe this? Where did this thought come from? What part of me resists letting it go? These questions cut deeper than any social debate. They expose the foundations of your mind. And this is precisely what our culture is starving for. Not more information, not louder voices, but wisdom. Wisdom is born from depth, from the willingness to explore silence, contradiction, and complexity. In a system obsessed with quick answers, wisdom asks better questions. In a culture of outrage, wisdom cultivates patience. In an era of mass conformity, wisdom insists on individuality. Reclaiming critical thinking begins with small acts. Pausing before you react, questioning when everyone else accepts, seeking understanding instead of victory. Each of these moments is a quiet rebellion against the current of collective stupidity. They may seem small, but they ripple outward. When you think for yourself, you become harder to deceive. You begin to see the difference between education and indoctrination, between information and propaganda, between connection and performance. You stop being a passive consumer and become an active seeker of truth. And the world desperately needs such seekers. Not louder arguments, not sharper insults, but deeper minds. Minds that can admit uncertainty without collapsing. Minds that can hold complexity without retreating into slogans. Minds willing to step into the silence that most people fear, because that silence is where clarity grows. This is what Carl Jung meant when he spoke of individuation. To awaken as an individual in a mass society is not just a personal victory, it's a contribution to humanity. Each person who refuses to sink into the collective shadow creates space for others to rise. The most revolutionary act today is not shouting the loudest, but thinking clearly. Not chasing approval, but pursuing truth. Not surrendering to the herd, but reclaiming your own mind. And once you've tasted that freedom, you can never go back.